My name is Josh Rauh. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a finance professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. It's a pleasure and honor to have been invited by Nick and Terry to moderate this panel on the potential and limits of environmental markets, which I think of as being a very central part of our conference day to day on markets and mandates. And Nick and Terry have just done such a terrific job of organizing this conference and building it year after year. And I'm as I said, very honored to be involved. So today we have two speakers, each of whom will be giving some remarks with slides. And what I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get at are what are both the realized and unrealized potential of environmental markets, and what are some of the policy obstacles to putting them in place. And in terms of their potential, we've known for a long time, as we think back to the work of Ronald Coase, that when there are externalities, as long as you can assign property rights, markets will be a solution. But of course, critics have sometimes said that the invisible hand does not always pick up the tab. So the question is, what are the limits of those markets? And what are the limits that are inherent versus those that are imposed by policy? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who is Will Rafey. Will is a professor in the economics department at UCLA. He teaches environmental economics there. He works on environmental markets at the intersection of industrial organization and environmental economics, using high-dimensional new data sets, modern econometric techniques, and studies water conservation and property rights. He's also been a technical advisor on President Biden's national climate assessment and advises clean tech startups in various ways to try to bring his research to markets. So I'll introduce Jonathan before your talk. I'll just turn it over to Will now and take it away.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Terry and Nick, for having me. This is some work I wanted to talk about that looks at some specific environmental markets, specifically those to do with environmental offsets. And these offsets you should think about as activities which often involve new technologies and can substitute for more traditional forms of direct conservation or abatement with alternative remediation strategies. And from a sort of first principles economics perspective, these kinds of markets for offsets offer a tremendous promise, in particular because if you can trade these offsets among people who have very different values, it's possible to attain very large private gains from trade, which equivalently you can think about as significant cost savings while attaining these original mandates, which relate to one of what Gary suggested as a potential market that we do see despite the history of these more mandate-based rules. On the other hand, there is often concern that these markets can lead to potentially adverse outcomes. And my view from a kind of theoretical perspective is that typically these arguments reflect the fact that there are many dimensions of environmental quality. Often they're hard to observe. And when not all of these dimensions of environmental quality are included in the way we design our rules for trade or for regulation, it's possible that equilibrium outcomes in these markets can be quite inefficient, in particular when those qualities are correlated in certain ways with the cost of market participants. And so for the rest of my comments, I want to talk about a large set of markets for wetlands in Florida based on some work that I have with a collaborator that's it's an NBR working paper. And this is a study of what are known as wetland mitigation banks, which are very large-scale restoration projects. This picture is Basin 22. It's in Indian County, Florida. It's about 2,200 acres. It's a project that over its full lifetime, which will be several decades, is slotted to produce 297 offset credits. These are credits that sort of typically transact at between $100,000 and $150,000. So this is a project with a lifetime revenue stream of between $30 and $45 million. Not all places are good for this kind of restoration. So you can see this is zooming out of Basin 22. It was a parcel of land that was part of a much larger ranch, much of which is still operational. This was degraded wetlands, and there were a number of activities that were undertaken to do this kind of restoration. And the incentives to do these kinds of restoration projects arise from a long history of mandates, going back to the 1971 Clean Water Act, 72 Clean Water Act, the Section 404A, which spelled out language that was a prohibition on, quote, substantial degradation of the waters of the United States. And so one interpretation of a prohibition against substantial degradation of the water resources of the United States is that we should do nothing with water resources, because that would be one way to enact that mandate. Of course, that kind of very extreme interpretation of the text be very hard to implement. And so since the 1980s, the Army Corps of Engineers, through a series of memorandum of understanding, have interpreted this statute to mean that as long as the water resources within a region are providing the same level of quality, then there has not been a substantial degradation. And Florida statute mirrors this in Florida Statute 373. And so these developers need permits to develop on their private wetlands, and they buy offsets from these restoration projects as a way of meeting their obligations under these laws. And in particular, it's important to think about the fact that in order for these markets to work, right, you can't get a wetland that's exactly where the development's happening. There needs to be some distance between the wetlands that are being developed and then the restoration projects. And so what that has led to are these markets which correspond to hydrological regions. So if we zoom out, you can see this is the boundary of the ranch and the mitigation bank. Zooming further out, you can see the bank site relative to coastal region of Florida. And you can see now, zooming even further out to a map of Florida, we can see some recognizable landmarks. That trade is allowed within this full region. And more broadly, if you look at Florida, you can see that it's partitioned into about 30 different markets that correspond to these hydrological regions, which are about 1,400 square miles. And so the opportunities for these markets depend on these market boundaries being large enough to accommodate many different kinds of opportunity costs of conservation, but not too large as to potentially lead to very unexpected or inadvertent environmental outcomes. And so I want to tell the story of these markets and the results of our research in two quick sets of figures. The first set of figures are a collection of maps. So we use 30 meter by 30 meter satellite data that goes back to the mid-1990s, and we can track changes in land use over time. And so this map is showing for one of the markets in our data, Hillsborough, a suburb of Tampa, two colors that are important. Really, the most important is this light green. These light green pixels were wetlands in 1995, prior to the introduction of these offset markets. The gray pixels are existing development, and it's useful to think about where they are, because one can then look at where development happened on these wetlands, and that's what these red pixels are showing. These are pixels which were wetland in 1995, and by 2016 have become developed. So these are the kinds of places, particularly like 99.2% of these are on private lands, these pixels that are being developed. These are places where developers would have needed to get permits, and in particular, they would likely purchase offsets to offset that development. And so the story of these markets is seen here with a lot of development in wetlands, on wetlands. And of course, the counterpoint are these large-scale restoration projects. And so these purple polygons are the exact boundaries of every single wetland mitigation bank in this market. So we see all of them in all of Florida because we have the administrative ledger data with all the contracts that each of them have signed. About 107 right now in Florida. These purple polygons you can see are quite different than the red pixels that we had before. Right? They're much larger because these rules reward contiguity. And they're also, if you kind of squint, much farther in the periphery, in the exact sense that they are farther from these gray pixels where there is existing development. And when you put the two pictures together, one can see a very clear pattern that is something which holds across all the markets in our data, that development on wetlands happen in these places that are already pretty developed, whereas restoration happens in the periphery. And that's not so surprising. I mean, that really is very exciting from the standpoint of the private gains from trade of these markets, because the places where there's already development are places where the opportunity cost of conservation was very high. And so we have wetlands moving away from those places, and that's the sense in which we can attain the objectives, or the stated objectives of these conservation rules, at lower private cost. Okay, so I said I would show this story in these two sets of pictures. These are the first set of pictures, just sort of giving you a sense of the spatial pattern of distribution. And now the second set of pictures are the results of the modeling that we've done to really try to capture the private values and the gains from trade, and also some of the environmental consequences of these markets, and then finally some ways you could design these trading rules slightly differently to account for these other environmental effects. And so this is showing now a map all of Florida on the left, and it's just shaded with redder local watersheds, places with more development on wetlands, measured in the way I showed you with that map before, pixels that were wetland in mid-1990s and become developed by 2016. On the right-hand side are our estimates of the private values associated with every one of the offset trades that we see in the ledger. So there are about 14,000 credits that were traded in all of Florida over this period across these markets between 1995 and 2018. And with a model of demand, we can actually construct estimates of how valuable those transactions were for the private land developers who undertook that development on wetlands. And so this corresponds to about private values for this development of approximately $2.8 billion. And the total transactions in this market were 1.1 billion. So we end up with $1.7 billion of consumer surplus, which is suggesting that even though these offset credits are very expensive relative to the kind of like nature conservancy, conservation buyback programs you would do, there's still a lot of money left on the table because there are people who have very high values for doing development on these private wetlands, or equivalently, very high opportunity cost of conservation. And every one of these trades, right, is something that would not have happened under a prescriptive regulation. Right? So you should really think about this as the value of flexibility of this environmental market. The flip side are the restoration projects, which enter at different rates across places. Of course, the key challenge for us econometrically in this is that when you see a bank enter, that tells you something about its costs, because if you see a lot of banks enter, their costs are likely lower. But banks also enter precisely in those places where there's a lot of unobservable reasons to be profitable. And so we have to deal with that endogeneity concern. But that's something we do in the paper, and we're able to construct estimates of these wetland restoration bank costs, and they're about $400 to $500 million. Of course, I told you transactions were about 1.1 billion, so that's about $700 million of consumer surplus or producer surplus for these banks. And so the value of this market's accruing to both sides of the trades. The total private gains from trade can be just constructed by integrating under these two curves, and that's the total value we estimate associated with flexibility of these markets. The final thing I want to say about the consequences of this sort of reallocation is that there are so many different values that wetlands could potentially have. Right? And we don't think we're experts in those values. There are very complicated ways of assigning credit for different types of ecological improvements, removing invasive species, introducing the right number of alligators, et cetera. We're not experts in that. The way the regulator has written these rules, it's supposed to take into account these features. And so this is, in that sense, attaining these ecological objectives for wetland conservation. But at the same time, and this is something that we really became interested in as we spent a lot of time talking to civil and environmental engineering people at MIT when we started this project, there is increasing concern that wetlands, in particular wetland disappearance, can change flooding and flood events near that wetland. The reason is that wetlands are very rough, and so they slow the rate at which water flows. They also are quite spongy, so they absorb water. So they act as these sort of natural levees and detention ponds. And so the distribution of flooding, in particular the probability of these peak flow events, which is what a flood is, can change when you change wetlands. And so the other part of our research is to ask kind of what were the flood protection benefits of some of these trades relative to the new flood protection provided by these wetland banks. And there we find a less optimistic set of findings, because it turns out that on average, many of these offset trades led to increases in flood damage because they removed flood protection from places where it had previously existed. And the intuition for this should be really the same from these private gains from trade, right? In particular, the value of wetland from the standpoint of flood protection is really the value on these surrounding properties, right? The way we construct this estimate is we take every single property that was built before 1995, before these markets were introduced, and see how flood damage changes in those places. And so this is something which you could expect to cut against the gains of trade, and it, to an extent, does, though it doesn't fully lead these markets not to have created value. I will close by saying that one could very naturally think about expanding the set of property rights further, right? And introducing some definition of the rights to not create flooding for other people. And that's what we do here. And the wonderful thing is that it turns out that much of the flood protection value is concentrated in a small number of watersheds. And that's not the case for the private gains from trade. And so if you redesign the rule such that you can account for this flood protection value, it's possible to preserve most of the private gains from trade and eliminate most of the flood damage. And it's, of course, easier to do that if you can define a richer set of property rights. If you define a much coarser set of property rights and you just say, well, you know, every single person who engages in this market needs to buy a single uniform sort of flood right, which would correspond to a uniform tax on the full state of Florida, you don't get results that are as nice, although you can shut down some of the value. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. I think this is really strong evidence, and it's exciting about the value of new technologies to allow us to take existing regulations and comply with them in ways that are lower cost. And with all kinds of environmental problems, there are always new things we're learning about the way these systems work, and so it's important to have iterative and adaptive regulation that can take into account this new information and sort of constantly reform.
Next presenter is Jonathan Colmer. Jonathan is a professor in the economics department at the University of Virginia. He is a co-founder of the Environmental Inequality Lab. His research combines data with insights from economic theory and environmental science, and he's the winner of a 2024 National Science Foundation Career Award in Economics for his work on the extent, causes, and consequences of environmental inequality in the United States. Jonathan.
Thank you, John. Thank you. It's great to be here. So I think whilst we're on the balance sheets discussion, I think Will's given us a few more assets to add to the balance sheet there with flood protection and wetlands. So I'm going to talk about markets for pollution, promises and pitfalls. A little bit more, though, on the air pollution side of things. And so I'm going to start with progress, because I think that's a really important place to start. So over the last sort of 3-4 decades, we have made substantial gains in human flourishing. Like Josh earlier was talking about what's the objective function. I'm firmly of the belief that the objective function should be human flourishing. And we have had expansive gains in economic activity in the United States, but also substantial reductions in air pollution, so improvements in air quality. That includes a sort of leveling out of climate emissions as well, and a relatively stabilizing sense of energy consumption. And so what's quite, I think, remarkable here is the sort of decoupling of these two events, right? And I think that's sometimes missed, right? We've had huge gains in GDP at the same time as having huge reductions or huge improvements in air quality. And so that is a huge win. So why this matters? Well, because these are assets to us as well. Right? Air quality is an important asset. Improvements, when we think about improving air quality, that has important consequences for life expectancy, our health and well-being, which I think we all value. Educational attainment. There's strong evidence that air quality affects people's ability to concentrate, to learn, and evidence on test scores as well. It affects the productivity of our workforce, which I think we're all in favor of, more productive workforces, and in turn affects the earnings that we make. And so all of this, in terms of these improvements in local air pollution, I'm going to talk about particulate matter, ozone, things like that, have had huge benefits to the American population in terms of flourishing. Further, these improvements have been largely driven by environmental regulations, mandates. But there have been markets in there as well, and I'll get to that. But that's evidenced by Joe Shapiro and Reed Walker at UC Berkeley have sort of done decomposition of the gains in air quality in the manufacturing sector. We had some discussion about this earlier regarding like how much of it is to do with environmental regulations versus outsourcing to other countries. It's almost all been driven by the Clean Air Act. Almost all of it, which is remarkable. We are incredibly good at improving air quality in the United States. Okay, we've done a really good job at it. Could we have done better? Could we have done it a less costly way? Almost certainly. Right? I am team markets. But we have done a lot, and we've done so in a way which has not completely crushed economic growth. Right? 341% increase in GDP versus a nearly 80% reduction in criteria air pollutants. That is just something we should celebrate, and that is American excellence. Like, that is a good thing. So the side note is that that has also contributed to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions without much of an active effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? So there are benefits there without maybe focusing on those considerations. And I think that this matters insofar as like, what is our goal? If we're trying, I'm an economist, unapologetically. But our goal, as I say, maximizing human flourishing, we should be caring about net benefits, right? So the traditional view has always been, well, environmental quality, but at the expense of economic growth, okay? But we've seen that not only have there been reductions in air quality alongside economic growth, but those reductions in air pollution have improved people's lives, their health, their ability to work. All of that contributes to economic growth, despite increasingly stringent regulations over time. Okay? These regulations have also driven innovation and efficiency improvements. I might even go as far as to say that perhaps environmental regulation is good for the budget deficit. We earn more money, we put less pressure on our health system, reducing indirect costs there. So there is, I think, a lot to be said for clean air. So improving environmental quality creates benefits, but what I might say to a previous administration is we shouldn't ignore the costs. Regulation is costly. What I might say to a current administration is, but we shouldn't ignore the benefits. Right? So we care about maximizing net benefits. That's what I think our objective function should be. So it's not just been regulations. There have been a lot of market-based mechanisms within the US over the last sort of 4 decades. We've seen the lead gasoline phase down in the 80s, the acid rain SO2 allowance trading program in the 90s, NOx markets in the 1990s, and then the Northeast trading. There's RGGI for climate as well. And evidence suggests that the flexibility of these trading schemes is where cost gains have been quite remarkable. We've managed to achieve environmental goals at 50% less, basically, than it would have cost. I'd say that now, in terms of average particulate matter concentrations in the United States, are well below the national ambient air quality standard on average. Right? So we are below that because of the innovation and the technologies that we've invested in, okay, which have been, in turn, driven by the regulations. So my sort of slightly more, devil's advocate perspective on this is maybe that it's not mandates versus markets, but it's markets on top of mandates is the reality that we're in. That mandates are kind of needed to create that scarcity, which markets then allow for cost reductions. So climate is a different ballgame, right? Talked about the local pollution benefits. The benefits for reducing particulate matter and ozone are local, and they're immediate. Right? Anyone who's experienced wildfire pollution, that's another session to come, but anyone who's experienced wildfire pollution knows what it's like to breathe. It's harder. Those are immediate consequences. The benefits from mitigating climate change are global. As it's been mentioned, it doesn't matter where those emission reductions happen. They are uniformly mixed within the atmosphere, and they are in the future. But the costs are local and immediate. That is a difficult coordination problem to address. This exacerbates the free-riding incentives, resulting in under-regulation relative to a social optimum. Again, human flourishing, global human flourishing, if that's your objective function, right? Requiring other people to rely on others to act, and coordination problems, and it requires that international coordination. Transboundary pollution problems are just more difficult to address. It's, of course, also not aligned with political business cycles, right? And so that becomes difficult. So climate is harder. I'm actually going to focus a lot on the climate side of things because I'm going to show you some successes where markets have played a role, and some failures. But I want to just note that doing nothing is also a policy choice. I think at this point we are aligned in direction that climate, I think there's less of a debate as to whether climate change is happening or not. I think the real debate, and is one that we should have, is how much do we want to do about it, right? And that is the economist's question, right? The choice to not mitigate is a choice to invest in adaptation. That is a fine choice to have, but it is the choice that we're making. The choice to do nothing is going to be costly in and of itself, but that is, again, a choice. So these are the debates I think we have to be having going forwards. So market-based approaches, again, team markets, like carbon pricing, are a way that we can reduce emissions at a lower cost. But that starts from a mandate, effectively, of what is our goal going to be, right? We have to set a cap, or we have to decide how much do we want to reduce emissions by. And so the success of how we then, whether we are successful in this is going to very much depend on how we design those markets and how they are implemented. I'm going to give you 3 examples, one success, one adaptation of a success, and one, I would say, pretty remarkable failure. So starting, in terms of what's happening around the world in terms of carbon pricing, there's been huge growth, a lot in Europe as well, the first and largest cap and trade scheme, the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme. As was discussed earlier, China has large ETSs implemented now. Canada has taxes and cap and trade schemes. It's unclear why you need both. But anyway, we can get into that on another day. But lots going on all around the world. I'm going to talk to you about a little bit of work that we did on the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme in a paper that's just been published in the Review of Economic Studies. We wanted to sort of set out to understand how firms respond to these types of programs. Like, what are the choices they make? Does it deliver emission reductions? What are the consequences on the balance sheets of firms as well? And so we were looking at the ETS. It was launched in 2005, the world's first and largest carbon market. And the premise again here is it's a markets and mandates kind of combination, right? You set a cap. That's what you want to achieve. And then the choice of trading through allowances allows the realization of that cap to be realized at a lower cost than if everyone had to sort of face the same reduction. It covers a large number of power and manufacturing plants, accounting for more than 45% of EU emissions, about 5% of global emissions. And they started off doing a very bad job. They over-allocated the cap. It was a classic case of hot air. And they didn't design the market very effectively. They didn't allow banking from phase 1 into phase 2. So what happened is that the price went to 0 because you had excess supply. Everyone could achieve the cap without any sort of cost. So I don't think of that as success because you didn't really do anything. So the price went to 0. In phase 2, though, there was a tighter cap. They did more auctioning of permits rather than free allocations. And that's where we started to see more action happening in terms of reductions in emissions. And then more recently in phase 3 and phase 4, the price has been continuing to rise. That's because the cap is continuously tightening in order to be aligned with EU goals. There's been more auctioning and there's been an emphasis to try and create stability in the market as well through a reserve system. We found that the ETS induced firms to reduce emissions by about 15%, and we found no detectable negative effects on the balance sheets of firms. So a sort of evidence of, lack of evidence of this sort of inherent trade-off that we've discussed previously. We didn't find evidence of outsourcing to other countries, not much anyway. But what we did find was that firms made targeted investments reducing the emissions intensity of production. And what we find is that these energy-saving investments that they made reduced the marginal cost of production as well as emissions. And so you might ask the sort of Chicago question of, well, why didn't firms do this before the policy if they're leaving money on the table? But the premise was that these are fixed cost investments, and it wasn't worth their while. But with the policy turning on, they now had this new calculus of, well, now maybe it's worth making these fixed cost investments, and they benefited from that through lower marginal and variable costs as well. Unclear whether that has continued as the price has gone up, low-hanging fruit to begin with. But that's what we found, at least in the first stage. We got actually a non-trivial reduction in emissions with relatively low costs to the firms. The extension of this is now a new policy that the European Union is implementing called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And this is to sort of engage with three critiques of what I describe as unilateral climate policy. Right? So these domestic carbon pricing mechanisms, they're subject to concerns about competitiveness. It's not fair on domestic firms competing in a global market. Concerns about leakage. One might expect that as the price goes up, you start outsourcing production to unregulated markets a little bit more. And then the free-riding concerns, which is, the EU's doing all this, but the global benefits exist. What do we do? And what this mechanism tries to do effectively is to create a price at the border which levels the playing field on all these margins, right? It levels the playing field because now it's the case that firms in other markets have to pay the same price on carbon as domestic markets. That addresses the competitiveness concerns. No point to outsource to China anymore because you've got to pay the tax as you come back in. So it addresses leakage concerns. And one of the things we find in our analysis is that it actually induces crowd-in of climate policy. Because now if you are India and you're deciding, I've got to pay the EU's carbon tax when I export, you can actually now raise tax revenues with no reduction in producer surplus, because the firms are paying the tax whether they like it or not, but they can actually now raise revenues, and then the choice is, do I want to send money to Europe or do I want to keep it at home? And so this is sort of an interesting crowd-in of climate policy that we're seeing all around the world now as a consequence of this new mechanism. So Will's talked a little bit about carbon offsets in the context of water markets. Carbon offsets, as I'm sure you're all aware, are a very popular tool in the context of climate, especially with all these net zero goals that we've all committed to with absolutely no idea about how we're going to achieve them. So theoretically, they're a win-win, right? In principle, the idea is compelling. Like, it's costly for me to reduce my emissions, but Judd at the back is very good at reducing emissions, and so I'm going to pay him to reduce emissions for me, right? It's kind of the similar idea with a cap-and-trade scheme as well, right? But the reason this works is because it doesn't matter where the emission reductions happen. They can happen in India, which allows firms in the EU to continue producing, and as long as those emissions are real reductions, you can achieve the cap at a lower cost. Right? But this requires two key considerations. Additionality, whereby you have to ask whether emitters are paying for emission reductions that would have been happening anyway. Yes, almost always. And this is not actually verifiable, despite a huge industry of third-party verifiers. I'd say, if you have a supply side that wants the transaction to happen, a demand side that wants the transaction to happen, and a third party that wants to facilitate that transaction, shocker, the transaction happens. The second point is a sort of slightly more science-focused one, which is permanence, which is when a firm emits a ton of CO2, that's there for hundreds of years. If you plant a tree and then the tree gets knocked down next year, that's not 1,000 years or reduction in CO2 emissions. So permanence is another consideration. We explored this in the context of the Clean Development Mechanism, which again is the world's largest carbon offset program under the Kyoto Protocol. And we basically found that 50% of projects were blatantly non-additional. Now, we had to come up with this thing. We called them BLIMPs. We were very proud of the acronym. But the idea here is that because additionality isn't verifiable, it's a counterfactual context, you can't really find additional projects. But we could find projects that were subsidized, that were just more profitable, blatantly so, than the projects that weren't receiving the subsidy. And so if you give a subsidy to a project that is just so profitable without it that you can find other projects that were successful without the subsidy, then that cannot be possibly additional. More than 50% of these projects were, and we actually find that they are so blatantly non-additional that if you'd use a lottery mechanism rather than picking projects, that you'd have done better. It's not a good case for how these things. And part of the challenge is that the design of these programs with adverse selection, with the non-additionality, is that you have this adverse selection problem. Looking into it, we found WikiLeaks reports where governments were basically like, yeah, we want these things. We want, our objective is not climate change mitigation. We just want the money. But basically, looking at the whole process, you see that host projects were basically picking the most profitable projects to receive support. And then the UN, the CDM executive board, basically didn't have the resources to actually vet these things properly. Again, you hired a consultant. That's part of the process. The consultant wrote a report that said, these things are additional. They give it to the UN, and the UN goes, stamp. Not more than 95% of applications were approved. I think we calculated that they were making a decision once every 5 seconds. So this is a problem. This is an example of where a market is not designed and implemented effectively. And the consequence was that basically, if you take our results seriously, which I think you should, although, we do a bit of a sort of back of the envelope thought exercise at the end. And here we basically find that the CDM, if you extrapolate our results, may have allowed regulated polluters to emit an additional 6.1 billion tons of CO2. This is a policy which the objective was to keep emissions down at lowest cost and instead increased emissions relative to if this program didn't exist, which is not great for the human flourishing argument, especially given scarce resources to mitigate climate change. So I think sort of the key take home of the point I want to make is that when we're thinking about designing effective environmental markets, measurement matters. We have to be collecting data, and we have to have the structures in place to be able to monitor and verify what's going on as much as we possibly can. We obviously need to create the right incentives, which require strong, clear price signals, and we need to build trust and transparency. Regulatory certainty is important. Confidence in institutions is important. And we need to have sufficient resources for oversight and implementation, which gets to the idea of low transaction costs, effectively. And if we can do this, then I think there's a lot of hope and a lot of scope for tackling many of the complex environmental challenges that we face. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm gonna kick off the discussion with a question or two. And my first question to both of you goes to my introductory remarks, which is I think from the starting point that I think a lot of us in this room like the idea of environmental markets and would like them to be successful. I was hoping each of you might be able to just comment briefly on the extent to which you think that how close are we to reaching the potential in the markets that you study? Are the limits to more markets, are they somehow fundamental, or are they practical in terms of we just need better design, or are they political in terms of it may just be impossible for them to be properly established by government? So, Will, in your case, I mean, I heard that these markets are increasing value, but they're also leading to more flood risk. So one answer I heard from you was we need more markets. So what are, how much further can we go? How much more potential is there, and what are the limits to reaching it?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think I guess two comments. First, one of the things that was really exciting for us, I mean, there really hasn't been any economic analysis of these wetland restoration banks at all. And part of that is because it's a relatively new thing in the time scale of the way academic research views what are the questions. And the reason it's so, I guess, novel, or arguably, I mean, the technology goes back pretty far, but the reason why it's been so, I guess, interesting for us is that these are really kind of new remediation technologies. And the fact that the government can have this open ledger where every offset that goes on the ledger that can be sold, right, is only something that has been verified before it can be sold, is a really cool feature of the market. And the extent to which you can expand the scope of things we can monitor and define the more opportunities that there exist. But I think something that our findings about these flood protection things emphasize is that the markets are only infrequently revisited. And so it makes sense that we would see a gradual use of these trading schemes because we want to kind of wait and see and learn as we proceed.
Great. And Jonathan, for carbon markets, how close are they to achieving their full potential, and what are the true limitations? I mean, you sketched out a number of ways in which they could be better designed. So, do they just need to listen to economists more, or are there other inherent limits or political limits?
Yeah, I mean, I think the constraint, and this has been true of all environmental improvements that we've seen in many different contexts, is that there's got to be political will. I mean, China has made insane progress in improving local air quality since 2014. The war on air pollution has been, insane to see. But so I think there always has to be political will to want to try and engage in these issues. But I think that the scope for markets is very bright. Like, I think, as Will was noting too, the advances in technology and measurements and the information that we have, all of this feeds into being able to design and implement better markets. But of course, it's always going to depend on the context and the institutional features that we're engaging with. But that's where, listen to economists more.
Okay, that's a good takeaway. I'll open it up to the floor. Yes, sir, back here.
Yeah, I have two questions, and they're really primarily for Jonathan. One has to do just with the interface between mandates and markets. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you needed mandates in the context of air pollution control and so forth in order to create scarcity and therefore kick off the potential for markets. Earlier, you had described all of these important health benefits for productivity and longevity and birth weights and all those kinds of things. If I'm understanding this correctly, those are primarily local. And I'm just wondering why, or if you have some insights, is why we would require federal mandates for problems and benefits that are largely local. In other words, what is the skepticism about local governments and regional parties to address this kind of pollution? The broader ones I can understand somewhat better, but it's the local ones. Why do you need mandates? And then the other thing I wanted to ask you had to do back with your discussion of the adoption of technology in order to address these climate change concerns, and sort of suggesting that they are overall productivity improving. And I wonder, are there studies about the opportunity costs of this kind of forced technological change? And what I'm thinking about in the debates over the early Clean Air Act, the automobile industry was really opposed. Now, they got all sorts of stuff. But at the end of the day, they adopted what was called technology forcing to design engines and vehicles and so forth to meet this. But what would have been the options for other kinds of technological change by these firms had they not been forced to engage in this particular type of activity? And I don't expect that you'll, but maybe you do. I just haven't seen studies that have looked at this opportunity cost.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the last part. I would sort of push back that they weren't forced. They had the choice as to how. One of the brilliances of having a trading system is that you have the flexibility to choose how to comply. And so it was, I think, by revealed preference in their interest to adopt these technologies, and it turned out that there were savings associated with that. But yeah, the technological forcing is one that I think is an interesting question, and I think it comes down to distributional considerations as well. You talked about the automotive industry. The costs are concentrated. Think about de-leading of gasoline. Like, leaded gasoline did a pretty good job at improving the efficiency of car engines. Did an awful job for people's health. I think on net, in terms of aggregate human flourishing, the benefits substantially outweigh the costs. But those costs are concentrated and the benefits are diffuse. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we face in terms of decentralized approaches, right? Which is, the concentration of voice and power. And I always think, when I'm teaching my graduate students public economics, the core question is, well, it's the trade-off. The fundamental trade-off was between market failure and government failure, which I think we were in a markets-oriented room. That's what we're really interested in. Like, there's sometimes intervention is more costly than the problem. But to your federal versus thing, I think I'm not necessarily. I think my point was more that that's the situation that we had, not necessarily that it was the best situation. I think there are reasons to have federal mandates, especially when there are transboundary reasons for pollution. You have to sort of adjust to that. One of the kind of classic quotes or the reasons the EPA was created was as the gorilla in the closet. This threat to state firms that if they weren't going to comply with state environmental boards, that they would, get sent up to the EPA, and that would be a sort of this federal oversight that would sort of help for reducing the frictions between state governments and firms. But I think you're right. A lot of the benefits are local, and I think you could have local targets. But then it's not necessarily there's still a mandate there to some degree. I think I'm being a little bit more colloquial in the use of the term mandate, right? Which is that we're setting a goal. If you set a local goal and then have compliance with that through markets or otherwise, that's fine. I don't know if that.
I'm going to collect two more questions here, and then we'll do a response.
Yeah, my question is also for Jonathan. I just wondered if you would apply some of your well-reasoned and well-tested skepticism about offsets to the border carbon adjustments, because another area where we see border carbon, trying to measure the emissions from a supply chain overseas. Think about, Milton Friedman's iPencil, something as simple as a pencil. You're talking about countless supply chains across the world. Another area where we try to do that is in California's low carbon fuel standard, where they try to assess all those emissions. And what happened there is they did things like, they found that California fuel tend to have a lot of emissions in its supply chain, so they simply exempted it. Or they found that there was a standard measure of the emissions associated with ethanol production that had been done by EPA, which is called GREET, and they said, that doesn't really give our ethanol production the same amount of credit, so we need to lower the scores for California ethanol and adopted a separate model. And so I wonder how, in practice, this idea that we're going to have tariffs, border carbon adjustments or tariffs on every product that enters our country based on our own estimates of their far-flung supply chains, I wonder what kind of problems that creates for a trade system that's currently under some stress.
Yeah, I think that's this is an issue that they're having to grapple with. It's the CBAM is being sort of rolled out, but the key issues they're trying to figure out right now are how do you measure these things in terms of embedded carbon? What are the accounting frameworks that you use? And of course, that is ripe for manipulation. And I think this gets back to sort of the limits and potential, right? Like with better technology, with more information, maybe there is more that we can do, but transaction costs may be non-trivial here. You'll be surprised to hear that a lot of the backroom chats are about exemptions. And of course, if everyone gets exempted, then what is the policy doing? But I think at least the spirit and idea behind the policy is encouraging. And the fact that there is so much discussion about introducing their own, like many countries are discussing introducing their own climate pricing and to offset the CBAM is a sort of, to me, a reveal preference that folks aren't thinking this is just something I can easily get by. I think there's actually opportunity here for me to benefit.
Related to this, I think, are some of the challenges inherent in cost-benefit analysis.
Of course.
As you mentioned, right, in order to maybe create a market, in many cases, the government has to create some regulation implement some regulation that creates scarcity, how do they go about measuring what the right amount is, where the cap should be, and so on, or even what an appropriate social cost of carbon is?
Yeah, I mean, just on that last point, I think over time we have systematically continued to overestimate the costs of regulation and underestimate the benefits. As we have got more information and better data and been better able at estimating the benefits of air quality and other things. And I think that's sort of the evidence base. As it's evolved over time, we've seen that the benefits side of the ledger, as we've got better data and better methods, has got larger, whilst the cost side, our measurement on that side has been sort of more stabilized.
I'm not sure. Do you want to jump in?
Certainly in air pollution. Yeah.
With air pollution, yes, but I would say generally a big advancement in environmental economics has been move away from stated preference techniques in valuation to revealed preference techniques in valuation. And, stated preference, that was what environmental economists did in the 80s and 90s, even in the early 2000s. And it was notoriously overvaluing.
Oh, yeah. No,
because it's cheap talk. People say what they'd be willing to pay for something. And so
I guess
the air quality benefits seem pretty clear-cut, but like the Clean Water Act,
much less benefits.
It's not clear the benefits exceed the costs, for example.
Yeah, no, I should be clear that I'm referring to the air quality benefits. But yeah, I think that your broader point, though, is that the methods and the tools that we're using have become more refined, and so our ability to get a clearer sense of what the benefits and the costs are has improved.
I'll continue if I may. The benefits of air have been dominated by health benefits, which are not things that would be asked in stated preference surveys. So the benefits of environment for, or policy for ecosystem services, et cetera, things that are hard to value, it's still kind of open question if that's. I wanted to ask a question since I have the mic, which is, I really appreciate your point about, the caps create some scarcity, and then you need scarcity and you trade. But following up on Josh's point, through political mechanisms or administrative rulemaking, these caps are set, and it's not obvious where they should be or what's optimal. So is there a better way, and this is also a riff on your point, Will, about involving more area for your offset scheme? My question is, what do you think of setting a looser cap to begin with, say for the price of offsets for wetlands, or a cap for pollution, be it carbon or sulfur dioxide, setting it really high to begin with, and then allowing a broad group of the population, like everybody perhaps, to bid on quota, right? So then you have more of a market mechanism to try to determine what that cap would be. So for example, like in fisheries, if we don't know what the quota should be for how much fish to catch, why not let environmental groups participate in that bidding? And if they really do value it, it's revealed preference. They have to give up something to bid for this quota. You're going to bid for carbon emission rights. You have to reveal what it's really worth to you. But through that process, can you get to a cap that's more meaningful than what you get from politicians and bureaucrats?
I think that's
Yeah, I think something in the background that's really interesting about the wetland restoration is this there's a cap, and the cap is zero. The cap says you can't degrade, and this is policy that goes back to the 70s, really interpreted to mean this in 1989. And it's also a cap that's zero in each of the regions that we looked at. And something that we have no answer to is kind of why that would make sense. Except as something that's very simple. And you could argue that just a simple rule is a rule that is, if you have no prior, but it's very hard to rationalize kind of a zero cap. And in fact, in practice, what these markets have done have led to a surplus of wetlands. if you do believe the way the credits work, because you have to have your credits issued as your bank once you've done the restoration. And then you can choose when to sell it. And so these banks have accumulated large ledgers of credits. And so it's a cap that's zero that also hasn't been binding. But I think, that's what I should say.
I like the ideas, though. I think it's the more we can, how those caps get determined, we all know is part of a political process, and that's where capture and other considerations come into effect as well. So the more we can, policymakers love experimentation, right? Sorry, British sarcasm. But yeah, the more like these ideas of trying different things and trying to understand what the optimum is, I think is more of that.
Okay, final question right here, Manuel Casardi.
Thank you. Would love your opinion on voluntary markets, both on the water side as well as the carbon side, because this is coming from a mandate perspective towards a compliance side. And it's interesting that some of the pitfalls that compliance markets have had on carbon have been addressed by the voluntary carbon market on monitoring and reporting. So there's a bit of a convergence happening on the market, but would love to get both of your opinions as those markets continue to sort of evolve.
Yeah, I think that on the voluntary side of things, I don't even really have a sense as to what additionality means there. The reason being is that when there's a cap in place, that's sort of, again, however that's defined, that's a sort of a limit. And the voluntary side of things is not clear to me. We focus a lot on the supply side, but the voluntary side of things is demand-driven. And so, I talked about the demand side want the transaction, the supply side want the transaction. There's a mediator that makes that happen. Shocker. But why do people want to voluntarily do this? Presumably there is some private benefit to doing it. And so I don't know how that can possibly be additional. And so I don't even, it just seems like that's just a preference for some green good.
I mean, I'll say like there are some models of equilibrium where you can have private certifiers who do provide certification, and if their reputation is a sufficient check on malfeasance, then they can do that kind of certification. But in a context where you have very long-run outcomes that you care about, I'm very pessimistic about voluntary entities kind of constructing these invented tokens and then trying to buy and sell them, because the kind of recourse and the limited liability that they have makes it much harder to do. In the context of these wetland restoration offices, the beautiful thing is the ledger is managed by the government, and the property rights are very clear. And the land for these banks are put under conservation easement. And that means it's in perpetuity under this conservation. And all the money is put in upfront in escrow to do all the restoration activities. And that's the kind of like long-run property right that you want, because if you're transacting with a company that might disappear, it is not obvious that they would provide you the level of product quality that you'd be interested in. And so one like general lesson that I have from the work I've done in the wetland thing is that I think really you need to work with the government to define these property rights in the same way that you're not going to trust a private entity to keep track of like all the parcels of land in LA County and who owns them. I mean, you want the county to do that, presumably. Well, maybe that's not the best example, but that's what
Coast would be happy at that. Government's job is to help define property rights and let the markets work. Well, thanks very much. We're out of time. There will be much more that I would have loved to discuss if we had more time, but thanks very much to both of our panelists.